Hey everyone, good morning. The Teach Better team is live for a 3-day webinar, a 3-day live series discussing your journey in lesson planning. We are currently in day 2, and I do want to give a special shout out to the nincompoop on the Teach Better team who planned the emails that were going to come after these webinars. If you guys are not on our email list, head over to teachbetter.com, scroll down on the home screen, and you can enter your email right there. We are giving away so many different freebies and recaps. And guess what? The person who scheduled those emails, they came out on the wrong day. So today you're getting a double email, and you got a lot more freebies that you're going to be able to enjoy. I would love to give a shout out to all of the team members who do their job really well. I'm actually the one that scheduled those emails and messed it up, so yippee to me. But we are in day 2, and we are focused on the middle of your lesson planning. So yesterday, if you missed it, you can go catch Josh and Katie. They talked all about starting your lesson with success. Now we're diving into the middle, and tomorrow, as we wrap up this live series, we'll be talking about the end of your lesson. Chad Ostrowski's in the house. My name's Ray Hewer. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, thanks for starting your morning with us. If you're catching this after the fact, please feel free to still use the comment section to document what you like and what questions you have. My name is Ray Hewer. We are here with Chad Ostrowski himself, and we are talking lesson planning. We are in a 3-day series, and day 2 is right here. Chad, how you feeling about doing a live series on structuring a full cohesive lesson plan for our community here?
I love it, especially because we get to talk about, like, I think kind of where the magic happens, right? Like if you think about lessons as like a bookended process, right? You're talking about systems and routines and getting things off started purposefully at the beginning of the lesson. You're talking about kind of closing things out in a purposeful way. So like those things most of the time tend to be pretty consistent in most classrooms because you're really creating that continuity for students, that safe and secure environment. So today we're talking about where the meat of the sandwich is. We're talking about that fun stuff that has the most flexibility and where the magic of how are we reaching our students with the content we need to cover? So I'm absolutely thrilled we got to do this part because I think it's super fun. Not necessarily that the other parts are less important, but this is, I think, some of where the sandbox that we get to play in of education really kind of comes to life. So I'm thrilled that me and you get to have this conversation, and I'm just excited to dive in.
Yeah, we have so much that we're going to try and cover in this short period of time. But please know, friends, even if I know we won't be able to get through all of it, but we are going to try. If you are enjoying this topic, if you want more on this topic, we have tons of freebies at teachbetter.com. But we also have an additional live stream, an additional webinar happening next week, July 22nd. It's at 9 a.m. Central, 10 a.m. Eastern. We're doing a partnership with Kami, which if you're not familiar is an amazing tool with a ton of free resources that you can also use in your classroom. And we are diving even further into more or less this exact topic, just in a different lens. So Chad, I'm really excited that we're able to not only have this conversation today, but also follow it up even as early as next week to continue to get our community some freebies. If you are watching us live, we would love to see you in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from, and also let us know if you have any specific questions. Maybe something came up as you're watching Josh and Katie's conversation during day 1, or if you have questions about day 2, this is a really beautiful place where we're not only live chit-chatting with you, but we also are here live to take your questions and make sure you get as much out of this as possible. Chad, before we get too far in, I know you're the co-founder, you're the CEO, you're Mr. Guru guy, but if someone's popping in and they're not familiar with who Chad Ostrowski is, do you mind sharing just a bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Chad Ostrowski. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Teach Better team. We've been on this crazy journey for almost 10 years now, working with teachers and schools across the country on everything from what started it all, which is the Grid Method Mastery Learning Framework, to almost every aspect of instruction you can imagine, from unpacking standards to depth of knowledge to classroom management and everything in between. So I'm excited to be here and share some of what we've learned in the last 10 years in this small segment, because it really does kind of all connect. It really does. And that's something that we found as a team, is we cover a lot of different topics in education, but every single one of them connects in some way, shape, or form to the idea of planning effective instruction, whether it's before that instruction, during that instruction, or the analysis or sharing of how that instruction went from like a grading standpoint or a communication standpoint. This is a interweaving of so many different topics. And I think that gets lost sometimes in education, because teachers see and educators tend to get a lot thrown at them. So they see the thing in front of them, but not how that thing can connect to all the other things. So to your point and how next week's webinar connects to this one, I think it's important for all educators to really try to see the forest in these conversations instead of the trees. And I think that's really, really important, because even the good idea here in the middle of our lesson sandwich, is really effective, but it's going to be less effective if you don't have a strong beginning. It's going to be less effective if you don't have a strong debrief or end to that lesson as well. So it all connects, but I'm really excited to kind of dive in where we're at here today.
So there's a lot of different areas we could start. Obviously, we're talking about the middle, the meat and potatoes in today's live conversation. Feel free to, again, use our comments for questions. But Chad, if it's okay with you, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. We focus a ton on mastery learning. We focus a ton on grid method. And it's not because it's something you created and we like you a lot, so we decided to use it. It's something that we've seen be incredibly successful. We have schools all around the country, all around the world, who are using this model to really improve student growth, student success, teacher retention, sub-shortage issues. Like, this is a big deal. So tell us a little bit about what pillars make up the grid method, because I think if you focus on those key pillars, whether you use the grid method or not, you're going to have a successful classroom, because those fundamentals are what you need in the meat and potatoes of your lesson.
Right. I mean, if you think about best practices and the highest impact practices you can have on a lesson, I tell this to administrators, and, Ray, you and I talk to administrators and curriculum directors and superintendents and educators all the time. And one of the things I often have to tell them is that there's no part of the grid method framework or mastery learning that isn't already a best practice somewhere else. So it is just a combination of best practices put into a single framework. And I think that's really important. The other thing I often coach administrators on when they're talking about this work on a larger scale is the idea that it can't be about the framework. It has to be about the practices within the framework that are going to move instruction forward. So if you're an administrator listening, I'm going to tell you the number one thing I'm going to tell every principal in every conversation I have is, don't create a villain with whatever PD or initiative you're starting next year in the fall. And what I mean by that is, if you focus so much on do the grid method or you're doing it wrong, you've created a villain because you've put a name to something that is now being seen as the only way to do it. But if you focus on practices like you're alluding to, no one can argue about what those best practices are. So you can easily think and reflect as an educator yourself, or as an administrator, you can share the messaging of, hey, listen, we need clear learning objectives articulated with multiple entry points for student learning. That's a best practice, regardless of if you're using the grid method or not. And that's going to improve student outcomes, whether you're in a framework or in some, other thing you're trying to push. A teacher can't argue that that's not going to help their classroom. So they can agree holistically with this idea. The next step is, are we differentiating? Do we have a plan for differentiation and tiered instruction so that all learners can be successful? whether you're using PACE like we do in the grid method as a tier 1 intervention, or whether you're tiering the instruction based on depth of knowledge, creating multiple entry points, whether you're providing multiple options for assessment, like differentiation, once again, high impact, easy to access for all students, increasing student potential and learning outcomes. The other aspect, go ahead.
Can I pause you for 1 second, and we can go back to this? So I'm going to challenge our viewers here. If you're listening now, thinking through, maybe nodding your head, this is a great point to put your questions in the comments. One thing I want to emphasize, Chad, is that differentiation is something many educators believe they should do, but they either don't have the time or don't have the resources, in their opinion, to get it done effectively.
True.
I'd love to see some questions in the comments if you fall into that category, because I know that Chad and I would be more than happy to lead you down different pathways to make differentiation not stressful for you, really efficient and effective for students, and allow you to be successful. One of them that comes to mind, Chad, and I'm sorry to take us down this tangent, is the use of AI to help create some of those tools and resources. So we can have you keep going, but I just know that that's going to be something that educators are going to think through, saying, of course we need these things, but
absolutely
is valid. But let's see if it's actually a concern, or if we actually have a solution and we just haven't found that right solution for us yet.
Yeah, and I think differentiation is something we could obviously talk at length about, right? I think there are so many new tools that make differentiation easier for teachers, like plugging into ChatGPT. What are 3 ways I can adjust this lesson for student needs, and getting 10 ideas, but taking 2 of them and using them in your class? You've now taken the mental load off yourself from the planning process, right? So the other thing we preach is like using PACE as a tier 1 differentiating factor automatically makes it part of your classroom. So what I would argue as a really effective a tool is think about the systemic changes you can make to the structure of your classroom that incorporate inherently some of those differentiation tactics. Because if you build it into the processes of your classroom, which, if I'm being honest, it's what the grid method does really, really well. But even if you're not in a grid method classroom, like thinking about how to make those part of your everyday makes them not an afterthought, but part of the daily experience students go through. So now it's not having to stress out about how are we differentiation. It's more about, this is how I teach. How do I help that kid on a personalized basis, right?
Yes.
So if we have a strong structure of differentiation, we can now individualize and personalize what individuals need, because the core foundation of their needs are being met by the structures of the classroom.
Beautifully said. Just to reiterate again, for those of you that are chewing on this concept, you're not planning a lesson and then when you're done thinking about differentiation options. You are planning a lesson that already inherently has differentiation in it.
Or your classroom itself and your environment and your structures
yeah,
inherently have those things built in, right?
Beautiful. Yeah, we are seeing your questions. We are going to get to them. Feel free to keep pasting those in. I love seeing you guys taking advantage of the fact that we are live. Chad, I want to keep having you go on this roll, and then we'll come back to these.
Yeah, so I think the other main point, so we've talked about clear learning objectives and targets. We've talked about differentiating and student needs, creating entry points and things like self-pacing. And the other thing that goes along with that instructional piece, that second piece, is also like, consider engagement there. How active are your students, right? Are they necessary or active in the process of learning? And then the other aspect is assessment. That's the other thing we talk so much about, is that how are you assessing if it was effective? How are you assessing if what you did worked, and what are you going to do about it later? So like those 3 big pillars, in my opinion, are, I think, where a lot of our work tends to happen. And now we can take any of those pillars and do 5 days of full PD on each of them. However, if I'm thinking about what are those big pillars that make up a good lesson, like those are those 3 big pieces, right? And I think maybe we can address some of the questions now, but those are like those three big points I would think about when I'm talking about what is the meat of my lesson look like.
Yeah, and that's definitely something, friends, that, I mean, it's July. If you're thinking through this but not looking to really commit to fully turning that teacher brain back on, that's a good note to like throw on a Post-it, throw it on your laptop, and as it gets closer to August, start questioning, do I have these pillars incorporated? How am I going to make sure that this is accessible for full year for my students? So again, we're not asking you to necessarily turn that teacher brain all the way on, but there's things that you can help yourself with right now. Don't work too hard. It's still summer. I see some great questions. We're just going to go in order here. One that I really appreciate Mike throwing in. Mike, thank you so much. He's an ambassador with the Teach Better team.
Absolute rock star. Yeah.
Absolute rock star, has done so many different teaching practices. Actually is very passionate about talking grading as well. So if you are looking for a new member of your PLN, Mike might be a good one to add. He's asking about the concept of pre-assessment, because as you shared, Chad, having students enter into the learning environment in different spots based on their needs, pre-assessment might be an option for a teacher. Do you mind speaking to this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always recommend pre-assessment in our trainings, in our workshops, and when we're talking with teachers, especially in the context of our self-paced mastery learning framework. So like when we're having teachers create grids, there's an entire progression. So if you pre-assess, you can actually decide that a student starts later in that progression or earlier in that progression based on data that you're collecting prior to instruction happening, or pre-assessment data. So like, absolutely, I highly recommend pre-assessing. But if you're not pre-assessing and you're looking at like a long-term unit or learning progression or mastery grid, like if I'm like not doing any of that stuff, I still think pre-assessment day to day is a critically useful tool. So something like doing a quick question and making 2 or 3 groups of cards of who answered which way, so that you can go, this is who understands what we did yesterday and who can do this. So like one of my biggest suggestions in every classroom is there should at least be preparation for 3 degrees of differentiation, regardless of the system you're using. You need 3 degrees of differentiation. 1 for the students who are still lost from the day before and haven't gotten what they're supposed to. 1 for students who are right where they're supposed to be. And 1 for students who are working ahead. If you can at least guarantee that you are prepared for 3 degrees of differentiation or 3 tiers of learning to happen in your classroom, that's going to get you a spot where you're going to be meeting more students' needs more of the time, which is going to boost your engagement because you're meeting in their zone of proximal development. But it's also going to boost your student results because they're getting what they need when they need it. And oftentimes when teachers go, Chad, the grid method seems like too much. How do I start this? Think of a 3-box progression instead of a whole grid. Think of a 3-thing progression. And here's the thing teachers do most of the time when I tell them this. They go, I got to do 3 things every single day. And I go, calm down, take a breath. It's going to be okay. No, what you do is if you make a 6-box progression of where learning needs to happen, think of like a blinder that only shows the first 3 boxes. And then the next day you just move the blinder over 1 box, right? So like now you're just scooting the vision of those boxes into these 3 boxes. So you don't have to have like 9 boxes or 12 boxes for a week. You could have 5, 6, or 6 boxes and then go, this is my week's progression, right? With or without a grid. These are the first 3 boxes we're focused on Monday. Then I'm going to scoot it over 1 box because the prior learning's hopefully closing that gap. So now the students who are on pace are moved to the advanced box. The students who are ahead are moving to the next progression. The students who are behind are where on pace were the day before. That was a lot and it sounded super jumbled. So sorry if that got confusing.
No, I'm with you. We're going to keep on this concept. And again, friends, there's so many options. So that's why these live series can get a little jumbled, because depending on where you're at, you, just like as we're speaking with our students, you have an entry point into this. We just have to figure out where you're most comfortable, where you may choose to challenge yourself, and where is the easiest spot to maybe take a pause, reset, and then move forward. Chad, it's interesting as I reflect on different educators I've been working with the grid method. Special shout out to those who, by the way, were just grid certified in our first program.
Our first ever program. Yes,
Our
absolutely. There's
official
some
graduates.
snaps going on here.
Yeah, official graduates. Actually, like last week that happened. So that was super exciting. Either way, I've seen two different things happening for grid users, specifically for those teachers who use the grid method, know a lot about it. One is they have pre-assessed students, and then they determine where to begin in the grid based on that pre-assessment. So for example, one student may begin at 1A, one student may begin at 1D, moving on from there. On the flip side, I know that I very often only required the assessments in my grid, and I had some sort of brain check, some sort of assessment in every single box in my grid. So in some regard, that was its own version of a pre-assessment, because if you got to a topic, which they're all labeled for the students to know, and they're like, wait, Mr. Ostrowski, I know this topic, then it would be like, great, don't listen to the lesson, don't engage with the content, try the assessment. If you've mastered this content and you can prove it to me, keep going, buddy. Otherwise, okay, we have some things we need to learn. Now let's go back and engage with the content a little bit. So for you as an educator, if you're listening, you might be doing some of this pre-assessment stuff already and not really giving yourself much credit for it, just a different perspective.
I also think you're highlighting the student-centered nature of our instructional philosophy, right? Oftentimes we go, a student needs to do something because I planned for them to do that. Or because I made it, you have to do it. But the only purpose that the thing that the student is doing exists for is to teach them the outcome you want to reach. And if they've already reached that outcome, that thing does no longer becomes necessary for the individual student, to your point. So if we know how we're assessing the outcome of a learning experience before it starts, which we should, okay, just to be clear, hopefully we do. If we know and a student goes, do I have to do all this? Can you tell me X, Y, Z? Because if they can say, yeah, cool, let's move on. But if I've only planned an isolated single experience and I'm not looking at learning as a continuum or a progression, I'm now stuck as a teacher because I'm letting the logistical barriers I've created for myself force that student to do something they don't need. And the reason they'll have to do that is not because they need to go through that lesson, but because I don't know what they're doing tomorrow and I haven't made it yet. And like, that's a logistical adult problem causing a learning issue for a student.
But we've all been there. So if that's
I'm not saying it doesn't happen, right? Like, absolutely. There's definitely times I've been like, hey man, I didn't make that thing yet. So could you just like chill for a minute and maybe just like kind of work on that? Yeah, absolutely.
It's not about the mistakes we've made. This is about, hey, can we do this better this coming school year? So I love it. It's just funny. Sometimes we like call out examples. I'm like, like I did last Tuesday, and it's
I didn't say I was not guilty.
So true. Justin, I love that you're jumping in the comments here. Thank you for participating over on YouTube. We're currently streaming on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. You got to go make sure you're following the Teach Better team. Just as a great question, Chad, I don't want it to take us too off topic, but we got to dive into this one. It says, does the grid method have a self-paced element? Or should students be working on the same standard most days, just at different depths of knowledge? So I'm just going to put words in Justin's mouth, so I apologize in advance. This is a teacher that's maybe hearing about the grid method, doesn't really know the fundamentals, may not know what it's all about, because I don't know, you're new to our Teach Better family and we love that you're here. Can we just answer some of Justin's questions to make sure he feels confident following the dialogue?
Yeah, the easiest answer is yes to all of that. But let me give context to why it's yes, right? So one of the core philosophies of the grid method is that it's that learning happens, not when learning happens. That's the most important thing. So students working at their own pace through the content is a critical aspect because we use pace as a tier 1 intervention in the grid method framework. Without self-pacing, you can still design a tiered lesson. But what I would suggest is think about a progression of learning that doesn't include time first. So like oftentimes when we're planning lessons, to Justin's point, because I think what he's actually asking is, hey, do they have to work at their own pace, or are they just all working on like different tiers of the same standard, and then they work on more of that standard at different tiers the next day? Like, both of those things could be effective. However, if we plan the progression, we don't need to plan a whole new lesson for the next day, because they just continue their work in the progression. So it's actually way more instructionally efficient to think of the unit and the progress through a standard or a unit or group of standards, which is what a grid is. It's a learning progression that carries a student from before a standard to after learning a standard or group of standards or unit. I'm trying to like keep us in the same silo without opening up this whole can of worms. So
no, it's good. I wanted to make sure to clarify for Justin, a grid might be on one standard. It might be
correct.
It might have
Yes.
6 standards in it. For example, if you're an ELA teacher, there's so many standards that you might choose to group together. If you're a writing teacher, I lived that life. There's some standards that you're like, I'm not going to do a whole grid on punctuation. I'm going to put like 5 or 6 of those meaty standards. Versus as a math teacher, which I also have been, there's some standards that are so hefty that you're like, this I'm going to make as its own focus. So depending on what you teach and what your focus is, a grade can encompass lots of different things.
Absolutely. So I think that clarification is important. So yes, the grid, it has a self-paced element. It's based on the foundation of students learning at their own pace or based on their level of readiness. So like a lot of times, Justin, I'm just going to tell you this because you might be freaking out if you're hearing this. It's not students do whatever they want, whenever they want. It's students are getting what they need when they need it based on their zone of proximal development. So if they're able to be pushed, we're going to push them. If they need more help, they're going to get it. If they're right where they're supposed to be, we're going to keep them at the edge of that productive struggle to get them the highest amount of impact at that moment in time. So the second part, should they be working on the same standard within the unit at different depths of knowledge? The way we show teachers how to create the learning progression includes multiple depths of knowledge. So in the grid method framework, they are working on the same set of standards at different depths of knowledge, but using pace to identify where they should be based on assessment data collected throughout the progression in their checks for readiness, moving from one learning opportunity or activity to the next. So there's a lot there, but I feel like that addresses at least his initial question.
Yes,
but
we want to, Chad, not to have you pause. I know you have so much to be able to share on this topic. I do want to make sure we stay on task for our webinar and live series today, focused on the middle of our lesson planning, whether you're using Mastery Learning or not. We just want to talk about good teaching in general. If throughout these conversations you've been like a little interested in learning about the grid method, rather than sticking here and having that conversation continue, I'm going to direct you to 2 different things. One is we have a webinar happening Monday, which is this coming Monday, July 22nd at 10 a.m. Eastern. We're partnering with Cami, which is a tech company, and we're going to be actually looking at the continuation of this dialogue. We're looking at 3 to 4 pillars of good instruction. We're relating it back to the grid method because Cami loves the grid method. And we're going to dive into how Cami can support making the grid method easier. In addition to that, we have a website that you can go check out. This is teachbetter.com/thegridmethod. As you scroll down, you are going to see a ton of stuff, almost to a fault. We have free and full courses on this. Look at all these ridiculous downloads. You can go grab any of these. These are all free to you to go see what's going on and everything in between. One of my favorite things to start out with is either one of the courses, looking at some of the templates, or these example grids can be really, really helpful. For those of you who've been using the grid method for a while, we also, based on your feedback, have given you the steps to do an introduction grid. I know a lot of you have been interested in that. So doesn't need to be something that you look into, but hopefully that is helpful for those of you looking for that spot. Chad, any final thoughts to add before we continue focusing on the middle of our lesson, maybe less specifically on the grid method.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important that we move to the idea that like every classroom is not a grid method classroom, even as much as like we'd like them all to be. But like the idea that every classroom isn't a grid method classroom is important because, like, once again, there are critical components of instruction, regardless of if they fit into the framework we're discussing or not. And I think it does benefit our audience and everyone viewing right now to go, I'm not doing the grid method yet. So, like, what else should I worry about? Like, help me out. And that, I think that's an important step. So Justin also thanked us for answering his question, said he tried something like this. He did say he wanted all kids to work on a specific activity. And one of the things I often say is, like, the grid method is the backbone of your classroom. It's the core path and journey your students take. It doesn't mean you can't take tangents or breaks and then go back to your main path. So Justin, it's totally okay. Don't worry about being stuck in that pathway and not being able to get off that road. You can go, hey, we're going to do this activity today, and then tomorrow we're right back into our path. We want to maintain that engagement and that active learning, which I think is also a place we could go to if you want next, which I think is also a critical component of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out. Justin, I also would love to be your best friend because we're both math teachers. So, like, we could talk shop about this anytime. Like, DM me. This is, Chet's a science guy by heart. So you let me know when the math nerd dialogue can come into play. I'm game. But yeah, Chet, let's go into active learning and engagement. That's something every teacher wants to know how to do. It doesn't matter what you teach or what age group. We always want to know how to be better in the classroom in this space. So tell us a little bit about what comes to mind. I know I have something that I love that really increases engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it starts with like philosophy. I think we have to think about what we're asking of our students on a daily basis. I think oftentimes it's really easy to go, my students aren't engaging, they don't try, they're unmotivated, and it's a very like outward conversation, which are all things we can't necessarily control. Like, we can't control their short attention spans, the fact that they watch 30-second clips, the fact that they use ChatGPT to solve all their problems. Like, we can't solve all those things from our perspective as a teacher. So the only, like, the teach better philosophy part of this to me is like, the only thing we can do to improve the situation is self-reflect. Right? So one question you can ask yourself about the middle of your lesson, if students are not engaged, is I want you to just simply step back and look from 1,000-foot view and go, if my students left the room, could this lesson still happen? Like, this is a fundamental question that I tell principals to ask, curriculum directors to ask, and teachers to ask themselves. If the students left the room, could my lesson still happen? And what that go ahead.
So what you're asking is, like, if I'm standing in front of the room and I'm kind of like preaching to my students,
right?
I could be doing that to empty chairs and nothing's necessary.
And nothing would fundamentally change about my plan, right?
Versus
like,
if I was doing like a discussion, I wouldn't have people to, okay.
Right. So if my lesson is dependent on student interaction, it is by default more active than if it only requires my participation. And if it only requires my participation, I cannot fault the learners for not engaging in that task in that lesson. So this is a first step when we're kind of analyzing active versus passive learning, because we cannot expect students to engage in a passive process. I'm not saying that passive processes can't happen. I'm saying if they happen most of the time, we can't fault the students for not engaging in our instruction most of the time. So I think that's like a bare bones first step that every teacher can do when they're thinking about that middle of their lesson or that big part of their lesson, right?
I just wanted to really quick take a pause for everyone to take a deep breath and brag that Justin messaged me and we're going to connect on Facebook Messenger. I'm like, hey, not to brag, Chad, math people getting together. Anyone else in this section, you DM us, we'll include you in the fun. But
and that's just, we love that stuff too on the team. Like, I don't think people believe us a lot of the time, and we're like, seriously, but like, legit, like we love texting back and forth and setting up quick calls and talking shop. Like that's what we do. That's what we're all about. So I love that. That's amazing.
So good. The other thing I want to mention, Chad, and I hate to take us off track from where maybe we needed to go. So we can go any direction. And please, if you're listening live, clearly we're live responding to you. Feel free to use the comments as a way to engage. Good morning to Megan Wells, by the way, who we see in the chat. It's always good to see her when she pops up. Chad, one element that really helped me manage two different concepts that have come up during this dialogue, one being student engagement, and the second being kind of overcoming the teacher fear of like ChatGPT and AI, and also is honestly the structure of the middle of my lesson to include as much student to teacher dialogue as possible. So I know that can look a lot of ways. For me, I'm thinking student teacher conferences, which can be anywhere from 10 seconds to 2 minutes long. I know that I obviously use the grid method, so that's worked into that system. But even if you don't use that, conferencing to me changed the game as far as engagement. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So one of the things I literally just said in a keynote, that was a few weeks ago now, on AI and education. And one of the things that I said is like, listen, we know students can have AI write a whole paper. We know students can have AI answer a multiple choice question or give them the definition of this or that or whatever. So the whole game has changed because it's taken the idea of, well, they can Google something and just put it on steroids. Like it's no longer the case that like they can look up an answer. They can create an answer with the tools that are now available to them. So the more artificial the ability for technology to create content, information, and ideas is, like the more artificial that becomes, the more human interaction becomes critical to the educational process, right? So the more artificial the creation process becomes, the more human the interaction around what is created becomes necessary. So now no longer can we go, hey guys, this is an active classroom, write a paper, turn it in Friday. If I expect them to just work on a paper until Friday with no interaction about that paper, I am asking them to use the tools available to them, which I'm going to go to ChatGPT and say, write a 3-paragraph paper with cited sources with APA style and XYZ, right? However, if I break the process of writing that paper down into chunks and make it part of the instructional conversation, the learning opportunities that are happening in my classroom with conferencing and peer editing around that work. Now, hey guys, let's think about topics and introduction paragraphs for our paper. Today, we're analyzing those introductions for our paper. We're conferencing and improving the parts of that paper. Now, whether a student wrote that introduction themselves or had ChatGPT do it is irrelevant, because the important part is they can have a dialogue about what was created, right? That's now how we have to assess the learning occurring in front of us as educators in the classroom. So I think it's critical. And to be clear, once again, this all goes back to the same thing: clear objectives. How are we teaching and differentiating the process, and how are we measuring those outcomes? So like if I think about it, me giving them a paper and going, write it, good luck, versus me creating meaningful experiences and human interaction around the product that they are creating. Now the focus is on the process, not just the product. And that's where the magic happens anyway. We want to be there when students struggle. That's when they do the most learning. I don't need to be there at the end of the process when they figured everything out. I want to be there during the process when they're struggling through it. So if we're missing that process in our class, we're missing all the learning. So I think that, to your point, right? With the new advent of AI and with the remnants and ripples from like the COVID learner, right? Like all of these things, we have to bring humanity back into the learning experience, because at its core, John Dewey, I think, would agree, learning is a social process. So we have to respect that. And we have to build the spaces for that social process, that human interaction, to occur around the learning in our classroom, regardless of the framework that we're providing around it.
So we have been able over the last 2 days to highlight the beginning of a classroom, how students are going to walk into the room, how they're going to prepare for learning, how they're going to get their brain moving. Today, we're focusing on that big middle section. How is the learning happening? How are we engaging with students? Tomorrow, for our last day in this series for your lesson planning journey, we are diving into the last few minutes of your classroom. This is everything from wrapping up a lesson, reflecting on the lesson, preparing students for the future lessons to come, everything in that area. Chad, I know that you aren't a part of tomorrow's conversation on screen, but I know that we have endless conversations on many of these topics aside from our live stream, just as an internal team. Any thoughts that you want to leave our community with as they are chewing on these concepts, as they're wrapping up their week? Any challenge you can give our community here?
I mean, I would challenge you to, especially right now during summer, as we're starting to think about kind of entering back into the classroom. One of the core values of our team is just being a little bit better every single day, small incremental improvements. So if you sat and listened to what Ray and I just talked about, and you're like, I can't do all that. It's already mid-July. The school year's coming at me like a freight train, or if I'm year round, it starts next week or whatever. I mean, you might be overwhelmed right now. So I want you to just stop. I want you to take a breath. And I want you to think about one thing you can do better that we talked about today. I want you to think, is it a more purposeful start to your class? Like even Mike Skapanik, like it even said like, hey, my sandwich doesn't have any bread. I focus all my stuff on the middle. So like, Mike, I'm going to challenge you, like maybe think about adding some bread to your sandwich, your lesson sandwich there. Just think about how you're starting on a productive from what Josh and Katie talked about yesterday, or how we're going to talk tomorrow with you and Katie about ending a lesson purposefully. Think about one piece or part that you can do to fundamentally change one aspect of your classroom. And I'm not going to guarantee it's going to go well. So this is the other challenge I'm going to have. Be willing to fail beautifully. So what that means is like, we don't progress if we don't try new things. And it will always be your human gut interaction to find your comfort zone as fast as possible. Be willing to fail beautifully, address it head on, and then move forward, because that's still progress. So try something, improve something every single day, every single week. Try to make those incremental small changes. And be willing to take risks and try things you haven't tried before so that you can either improve them or decide that you're never doing those things again.
I love it. Friends, as you are sitting by the pool this summer, recharging and reflecting, don't forget this is also a great time to fill your toolbox. Even if you weren't able to sit down and really focus on this live stream and take notes, who cares? Just save it for later listening. Put it somewhere. Set yourself up for success. You do not have to do all the thinking right now. We do not have to solve all the problems, but we do want you to know that when and if you become ready, we are here to give you as many free tools and conversations as humanly possible, including encouraging all of you to reach out to us. Chad, do you mind sharing how our community here can stay connected to you? Maybe just like your email account. I know you're so active on email. If they want to talk through some stuff, or maybe they have a principal that they're friends with or that they work for, and they're like, I really would love to bring this to them. Can we connect?
Absolutely. Chat@teachbetter.com is the easiest way. Shoot me an email. You can also find me on social media pretty easily. Feel free to DM me on any of your favorite social media channels. But email is always the easiest and the quickest. And I love connecting. So please, if you have questions, if you want to reach out, you're just like, hey, I think you're crazy. Tell me why you're not. Like, that's fine too. And I'm always okay with those conversations. I'm pretty sure I'm not, but I'm willing to hear why you think I am. No worries at all. So absolutely reach out.
Friends, we hope you stick with us as we continue on this incredible journey, diving into lesson plans. We are back tomorrow for day 3 and wrapping up this conversation. Thank you for joining us this morning. Feel free to share these links if you enjoyed this conversation so your colleagues, friends, and family can see new ways to think about teaching, and we will see you soon. Bye, guys.